And, of course, none of this would be possible without this year's sponsor, changing my job twice. Also, shout out unemployment. Got my first unemployment of my adult life. Felt like a big step. And that's why I couldn't finish all my reading goals. No. What? Welcome to the 2023 wrap-up. It is a bit late, but do you expect better from me? Come on, kind of awful's my aesthetic, what have you. I'm going to start out with a wrap-up review of my reading goals this year, and then I will get into superlatives, stuff like, you know, best cover, best book, biggest surprise, stuff like that. So first, with my reading goals, I feel like I scored about a 50% with my formal reading goals, and then like a 15% with my informal reading goals. Each of the last 3 years, I've made lists on Goodreads where, you know, they're sort of meant to be like an aspirational visage that I choose from of what I could read this year. So I put together like a really small list of just like, okay, let's try and prioritize these 14 books, right? 14 books isn't hard. I could get most of those, if not all of them, depending on my mood. I read 2 of them, okay? 2 of them. One of them was a foregone conclusion because it was already the first book that I was going to read that year. It was Stella Maris, because the last book I read of the previous year was The Passenger. So I kind of straddled years with those two. But nonetheless, 2 books. So it was a big year for mood reading. It was also a big year for poetry. And poetry is only and ever mood reading for me. Most of the poetry I read was from Deep Vellum Press, which, oh my gosh, I just made a video about that. You should go watch it and see what I said about it, because it'll also be relevant later. But I also read some non-poetry from Deep Vellum Press this year, one of which, teaser alert, I'm going to talk about as my biggest surprise of the year. So that was an interesting sub-theme that developed throughout the year, but which was definitely not planned. As far as official goals that I set for myself this year, I missed my big and ambitious goals, and I got my very easy cakewalk goals. So the stuff that I succeeded at, again, very easily obtainable, very tame. One of them was that I wanted to read a Robert Coover book. And so that was, I thought I was going to read Prick Songs and Descants, and I actually started that. And then I just got the itching for Origin of the Brunists instead. And so made a video about that. You can go check that out. And then the other goal that I set for myself was, hold on to your pants because this is ambitious, read 2 books from before the 20th century. And I read exactly 2 books from before the 20th century. So that was Moby Dick by Herman Melville, and then Notes from the Underground by Fyodor Dostoevsky. As far as reading goals that I failed to achieve, I said I wanted to read 4 500-page books, but I wanted them to be physical books. Because technically I did achieve this goal if we count audiobooks, but I specifically said excluded audiobooks when I set that goal. So I read 3, I scored a 75% on that. And then the other thing that I said I was going to try to do this year was, this last year, was read a 1,000-page book. And I didn't even come close to attempting that. So bad on me. Next year, maybe? We'll see. So let's start off with the downers of the group. I'm going to go with biggest disappointment. And so I have 2 books for this. The first one, unfortunately, is going to be Pirate Enlightenment by David Graeber. I'm a fan of David Graeber. I've read most of his major works at this point. This book just ultimately didn't feel fully fleshed out, which was my fear when I went to go buy it. I was actually quite surprised that it was this small when I was in the bookstore to buy it. It ended up just being really unmemorable. I think there was a kernel of a good idea in here, but the material didn't end up being as earth-shattering as previous Graeber books had been. In part because Graeber in this book admits that he's being provocative and that he's making a lot of conjecture here. It's small. It's only about 140 pages, and it's obviously, if you don't know, published posthumously. And with great writers, fiction or nonfiction, you see this happen a lot. A thin little half-finished or just underdeveloped idea that I think sparks some interesting conversation, moves book sales, obviously. The book is about, he's discussing all these ways in which like pirate civilization was ahead of the curve or influencing Enlightenment thinkers. And I thought it was going to be a little more conclusive and like showing direct links of how that happened, but it didn't really live up to that promise. Interesting little curio, nothing more. Graeber's got way more interesting stuff than this, and it did make me want to dig into his first book, which is Lost People, because this takes place, on Madagascar. That's where this like pirate civilization is. That's where Libertalia was rumored to be from, or where it was from. And so Lost People is an actual like proper ethnography. So I'm interested to read that, at least, because I think that'll be more substantive. The other book that I'll go with as my biggest disappointment was The King of Trees by Cheng. And I just think I let this one get a little overhyped. I mismatched my sort of expectations for it. I was really excited at the fact that the second story was going to have to do with chess in some way. And it just left me, again, with this feeling of, is this it? I think this could be like a good and useful novel to read. It's a series of 3 novellas, right? Or stories, if you want to call them. They're literally each like almost exactly 60 pages. But I think it's a great thing to read if you want to get like a cursory sort of introduction to the Chinese Cultural Revolution. It feels like that kind of historical fiction that you'd read in a high school class if you were studying Chinese history in a high school class, which you might. You might be studying the Cold War, so it might come up then. I don't know. I'm not a high school history teacher. But yeah, I thought it was going to be a little more psychological, and it just didn't end up gripping me. It's more of the almost kind of generic, I don't want to say generic, but like almost the socialist realism genre, if you know what that is. It felt very obviously influenced by that, which I'm sure it was. Okay, let's go on to biggest surprise. My biggest surprise of the year was The Conspiracy by Israel Centeno. This is a Deep Vellum Press book. It actually comes from Phony Media, which is an imprint of Deep Vellum Press. And this is a book about how these sort of long-suffering revolutionaries in Venezuela respond to a left-wing president, and that president matches in broad outlines what Hugo Chavez looked like. And it's got the best opening line of any book I read this year, and maybe any book I've read in a couple years. In Buenos Aires, they called it mist. In Mexico City, smog. When the wind from the Sahara blew and covered Santa Cruz de Tenerife, the islanders knew it as haze. In Caracas, there was soot, and I was moving through smoke and ashes on the day I went out to kill the president. And so that haze, that smog, that soot, that smoke is kind of ever present throughout the novel because the exact details of things are not clearly explained to you. You're picking up scraps along the way, but it's a leftist factionalism assassination plot, basically. And it's kind of all born out of the suspicion that members of the leftist organization, as it's called, feel for each other. This organization is not strictly defined, but it's obviously like a conglomeration of, paramilitary and political interests, and that are all using at least Marxist rhetoric. I hesitate to call it theory because the book derives much of the conflict from the varying cynical interpretations of theory. People are only consistent insofar as it ensures their survival. So there's an assassination plot, the one that's, kind of mentioned at the start of that novel, and it fails. And so the novel is the story of kind of the chase scene across the country afterwards, and how one of the senior leftist revolutionaries is appointed the head of internal affairs of the new president's administration, and he tries to hunt down the would-be assassin that was once his fellow leftist revolutionary. This book delighted me. It's kind of manic and just barely stays on the rails. It's sort of an out-of-breath political thriller that mixes in a fever landscape that feels ethereal and illogical and just strange in a way that felt refreshing when I was reading it. It's just the right amount of unhinged for me right now. Best cover, I am going to go with Hallucinated City by Mario de Andrade in this really bold red. This is from Sublunary Editions in Seattle. This is their Empyrean series, so all of the books in this series are basically the same cover. But let me tell you, it's a winner. I just really love red covers. I have a whole, you can kind of see it in the background. There. This book has been lauded as the Bible of Brazilian modernism. Lots of ellipses in the poems. That's stylistically not my favorite, but it's still very accessible and still highly, highly enjoyable. It's not like a high degree of modernism. Think non-Wasteland T.S. Eliot. It's not like The Wasteland is what I'm trying to say, but it's very good, and I would recommend both the physical object, if you can get it, and the collection of poems themselves. And now let's get to the best books of the year. I'm going to do a best for poetry, nonfiction, and fiction. And the first two I've done videos about, so I'm going to go through those pretty quickly. The best poetry book of the year was Standing on Earth by Mohsen Emadi, translated by Lynn Coffin. Don't ever forget the translator. In fact, let's look at who the translator was on Israel Centeno's seminal work, Guillermo Parra. And then Cheng was translated by Bonnie S. MacDougal. So I probably won't edit that back in. That'll just appear now as it's appearing. So, like I said, I talked about Standing on Earth in literally the last video I did, so you can go check that out. I won't repeat myself too much, but this is an Iranian poet who now lives in Mexico City, and he is heavily influenced by the poetry of Federico Garcia Lorca, as well as his native folklore and culture from a place called Mazandaran in northern Iran. His subjects range from the impossibility of language, romantic love, exile from his homeland, and Iranian politics and martyrdom. Best fiction book that I read this year, I've already done a video on this. This was Origin of the Brunists by Robert Coover. Robert Coover is one of my favorite writers of all time with this book, officially. He's just got so many bangers. This was a debut novel that is every bit as impressive, I'm telling you, as The Recognitions or by Gaddis or V by Thomas Pynchon. So it concerns a mining accident that kills nearly 100 people and sort of the apocalyptic cult that kind of hops up in response to that tragedy. And it's very much like a small town book, right? It's focused on West Condon. I think it's Illinois. I don't think it's Indiana. Might be Indiana, but I think it's Illinois. It's fake anyway, who cares? But yeah, and then so there's this cult that pops up, and so the local newspaper starts digging into it, and the cult makes a couple of failed prophecies, and that sort of keeps the whole thing going through the news media. But then because the news media talks about it so much, it actually gains a kind of traction across the wider country. Great book, highly recommend, one of my favorites of all time. Check out my video on it. Check out Robert Coover, he's very good. And then for my favorite nonfiction of the year is a book I have not talked about, but this was If We Burn by Vincent Bevins, The Mass Protest Decade and the Missing Revolution. This book looks at a bunch of different mass protest movements throughout the world from the 2010s and how in the overwhelming amount of times you had protests that achieved basically the opposite of what they were asking for. A lot of these movements began and often imitated each other because they're social media spectacles and they're protests that were largely good at being captured on social media. And that was kind of the first step, right, in terms of grabbing mass attention toward the issue that each of them ended up being about. The problem became that when a lot of these smaller targeted protests that were, the result of like horizontal organizations, once they blew up to become sort of true truly revolutionary, where they had the attention of, the existing power in place, there wasn't enough coordination or coherence to execute in the bargaining stage with that power. Bevins lived in Sao Paulo as a journalist for most of these years and was directly involved in covering the protests that began as a movement for free bus fare in Brazil and ended up sort of giving rise to the Bolsonarista movement. It looks at movements all over the world, from Brazil to Tunisia to Hong Kong to Chile, South Korea, Ukraine. None of them, it explores a little bit tertiarily with regard to the United States, but only as kind of a reference to that maybe protesters are sort of referring to. And there are some successes or partially successful movements. South Korea's movement was generally the most successful because it was basically just all about impeaching the president that was corrupt, or sort of multi-generationally corrupt, or, unduly influenced by a spiritual guru that was taking financial advantage of them. Anyway, so that was the most successful. Ukraine and Chile were the other two that he kind of considered partial successes, at least. They didn't get a new constitution in Chile, and they certainly didn't get rid of the Russians in Ukraine, but neither did Ukraine get completely subsumed by Russia as, Hong Kong did by China. But yeah, I mean, you look at some other movements and Tunisia gained democracy for 10 years and then lost it. As I mentioned, Brazil wanted free bus fare, but they ended up getting Bolsonaro. And, so many of those people that were trying to organize the free bus fare movement were very, very left-wing and anarchistic. And Hong Kong, as I mentioned, wanted independence, but only got further subsumed by China. So there were a lot of failures, and it takes that head on. It offers a constructive critique of dogmatic horizontalism in leaderless mass movements. And even more, it's a great history of the recent world by someone who lived it and who is, re-examining his own naivete and his own part in how he covered some of these events. And so there we go. Those were my best books of the year. As far as goals for next year, I will be honest, I only have one goal. It is singular, and that is to read this book that I've talked about in, I think, my last two wrap-up year videos. Divine Days by Leon Forrest. It's about 1,135 pages, so this will make up for the 1,000-page one that I didn't read last year. But I'm definitely going to read it this year. It's on my calendar, so to speak, and I'm probably going to start it within the next month or two, I would guess. So yeah, definitely looking forward to diving in. I'm not going to make my goals any more complicated than that. Thank you for watching. This is my third time recording this video, so I really hope I'm in focus and the audio is working this time. Please, please, please. Okay, till next time.